what I do see is some continuity. When I was working against totalitarian ideology called communism, there are similarities between fighting that ideology and fighting this totalitarian ideology of Islamic supremacism, as Jeffrey Im puts it. It is the same kind of domination that is being sought. A domination not only over one's own faithful or believers or followers, but to impose that on everybody else in the world. And I'm an American, I object to that.
The United States is in their sights?
Yes, the United States very definitely is in the sights of Islamic Jihad. And the reason that we know that, for instance, comes to light in the recently concluded second trial of the Holy Land Foundation, which, as we know, was a trial held first in 2007, later in 2008, at which time they obtained, at the end of November last year, 108 unanimous counts guilty as charged, terrorist funding to Hamas. Now, among the documents that came to light in that trial are a number of documents of the Muslim Brotherhood. And among those documents are statements, very frank statements, if you will, that describe exactly what the Ikhwan, or the Muslim Brotherhood, intend for the United States. And they say, quoting loosely more or less, they say, we, the Ikhwan, we will sabotage your miserable house with our hands from within. In other words, their intention is to bring Islam to the United States, to bring down our Constitution and substitute it with Sharia. I think that's going to, because not only are these organizations and groups advocating a particular position, but they now have the primary spokesman for those positions, which are inimical, as I say, to American national security policy. Those spokespeople are now moving into the government, as in the case of Ambassador Freeman, as in the case, another one is Dr. Vali Nasser, who has just been appointed a senior advisor to Ambassador Holbrooke for policies related to Afghanistan and Pakistan, both of which border Iran. And so you not only have now the organizations of these different groups advocating for this kind of policy, you have their very spokesman being appointed into the administration. That, to me, is a very successful influence operation.
And what's the source of this influence?
The influence is coming from those who are opposed to our national security interests, in my opinion. When you advocate a position for negotiations immediately with Iran, no preconditions, when you are willing to turn a blind eye to their nuclear weapons program, to their human rights abuses, to their support for terrorism, to their opposition to the peace process in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis, when you have that kind of a policy position being urged and being seriously considered by the administration, as we see it happening right now, and the primary spokespeople for those positions being appointed to extremely high-level and influential positions within the government, then I think you have good reason for concern.
How is it making it up through the Obama administration in so short a time?
I think it's not been a short period of time. As I write in the paper, which was published by the Center for Security Policy just this past week, this effort at promoting influence, advocating these positions has been going on now for at least 5 to 10 years. In terms of Iran specifically is what the paper is about, so I'm speaking to that issue particularly. If you're going to talk about Saudi Arabia influence, and that would be the Sunni side of things, obviously that influence has been going on since the oil money started pouring in back in the 1970s. And what did they do with that oil money? They exported their influence through building of mosques, through publications, through staffing of mosques with their preachers and imams, and as well they endowed American universities. They bought shares in Middle East studies programs at our top Ivy League universities. And when you have that kind of influence coming in, there are strings attached. So I would argue to you that the graduates of the top programs in these universities in the United States, the Ivy League schools, the graduates of Harvard and Yale and Stanford and so forth, where do they go when they graduate? They go into the government. They go into the Department of State. They go into the intelligence community. They also go into the think tank community and the NGO community. And that's been going on now for 30, 35 years or more. And so when you say, how did this happen so quickly? It didn't happen quickly. This has been going on, planned and funded carefully for many, many decades. And on the Iranian or the Shia side, that operation has been going on, I would say, at least since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, but it really kicked into high gear more recently, and I would say probably from around the late 90s to the present time. It really shifted into a higher gear. And that's when they started forming organizations that are think tanks or NGOs, beginning with organizations like the American Iranian Council, headed up by Hushang Amiramadi, for instance. And then there are many more newer organizations, which you'll see in the paper, which came along much more recently in the time period even since 2000, 2005, 2007, 2008. These new organizations are sprouting like mushrooms around Washington, D.C. And if you look at them, you'll see their boards of directors are interchangeable and interlocking, which is to be expected when you have an interest group with the same ideas. But the problem is not that they're an influence group or that they're pushing a particular policy. The problem is that that policy coincides with the favored policy of the regime in Tehran, and that is on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terror, the number one top position ever since the list has been kept. That's the problem. It's my position that I write in the paper, The Iran Lobby, that an effort to influence not just this administration, but every administration going back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and throughout these decades, the effort to influence American foreign policy. It's strong, it's very well funded, much of the funding comes from Saudi Arabia. It's an influence operation. To do that, what do? They form NGOs, they form think tanks, they sit and serve on each other's boards of directors, they swap positions, they write papers for each other that go posted up on each other's websites, and they share some of the same funding sources. And this influence operation has been aimed at influencing United States government and its policies towards the Middle East for many, many decades. And it's very troubling, in my opinion, because it's so well funded and because it's inimical, in my opinion, to American national security interests. There's nothing wrong with lobby groups, who want to advocate for their position. But when the money and the backing comes from regimes such as Saudi Arabia's or Tehran's that are fundamentally opposed to American national security objectives, then that's a problem.